Hi, my name is William Wood Harter. I go by Wood. I'm a solutions architect for Luminoso, and I'm going to go through how to use the API. Daylight has a really robust user interface where we can explore our text information and find all kinds of amazing insights. It's only half as powerful as this amazing API, and anything you do in the UI, you can do in the API, and there's many things you can do with the API that you can't do in the UI. So it's worth exploring, and you need some minor Python skills to actually do this. Well, the first thing we're going to talk about is how to set up, what the API documentation looks like. We're going to install a virtual environment with Python. We're going to talk about using the API and create a little notebook to do that. First up is the setup. So there's two forms of documentation. The first is the core API here. It's available to anyone under daylight.luminoso.com/API/v5. And here are the topics here. And this part has the endpoints that you'll use. Things about projects, creating projects, documents, how to get documents, how to get the terms, how to get the concepts and the drivers and the sentiment. And the rest of it is a lot of user navigation. We're not going to talk about those today, maybe in another episode or something. And the most important ones on this are filters and concept selectors, and we'll probably have a whole session on that as well. If you look at how to create a project, again, this is just a RESTful API. You can call it with any language. We have a Python library that I'm going to talk about next. But in general, I've used this with JavaScript, Java, of course, Python. And to create a project, you call post on API v5/projects. You're going to give it a token, which we're going to talk about next. You give it the name of the project and the language of the project. That'll create the project. And then you're going to call upload a bunch of documents. And then you're going to say build the project. And we'll go through that process at some point. Today, we're just going to look at an existing project. The next step is the Python client, and you can find that here. It is under PyPy under Luminoso_API, pip install Luminoso_API. The next step is to talk about the installation, and you need any Python between 2.7 and 3.9. The way you do is you create a virtual environment. We're going to activate that environment. This is how you do it on a Mac. This is how you do it on Windows. And then we're going to install a couple of modules, Luminoso API, and then we're going to install a couple of modules, Luminoso_API and this URL lib3. There's been some issues with compatibility on Mac, an SSL library or something, so I just backed it down to the version 2.0 has some issues on every Mac, and this will probably fix itself eventually. So the next step is to show you how to do that. So I'm going to create a virtual environment, Python -m venv, and there it goes, and it creates it. This creates a folder with a whole Python inside it, and then I'm going to say to activate that, source./venv/bin/activate, and I run that. Now I can see I'm running that virtual environment. Pip install Luminoso_API, and then pip install URL lib3 equal 1.26.6, and that installs that. Now the next step is to get set up on authentication. How do we talk to the API with our account? How do we get in? What do we give it? And that is going to be with a token. If I go over to Daylight here, I'm looking at a project here, and I choose my name on the right, upper right, and I choose settings, and I go to tokens here. I'm going to generate a new token. I'm going to create the token. I'm going to give it a name, API training. I'm going to type in my password. And then I say create token. This is going to show me the token one time. I copy that to the clipboard, and I have to save it. That's going to be the important part. You save it. The way you do save this is, the easiest way is to say Lumi. This came with the Luminoso_API module, Lumi save -token, and I give it the token that I just copied off the clipboard, press enter, and it's going to save that token in your home directory /.luminoso, and there's a file called tokens.json. So all your tokens will be saved in there. The Python library will actually use that file, so you don't have to save it into your code or create an environment variable or anything like that. There are ways to give the token, use environment variables. There's many ways to use it, but this is probably the easiest way to go. If you don't want to go through that whole process, you can simply say lumi-save-token, and it'll ask you your username and password. At that point, it will generate a token and it'll save it in that file. That's the other way to do it. So once you've got that token saved, you can start talking with the API. First things first, this might be a way to connect. If I want to put my token into code, I can say client Luminoso connect, give it a URL. In this case, the URL is HTTPS. If you don't have the S here, it's gonna give you some strange errors and it might take a little bit to figure it out. It just says, hey, there's no endpoint here. And you're saying, oh, I did put in the right thing, but it's not right because it's not talking to the right web server. So HTTPS, Daylight, Luminoso.com API v5 is the root URL for the API. You pass that to the Luminoso client connect function and you give the URL and the token. If you don't give it, if you don't give it the token, it will go and look in that tokens.json file. Again, here's how you save the token, or you can use your username and password. If I want, this is something that I do a lot of. If I parse the URL, I have a little function here. I'm going to copy and paste that into our first notebook. First things first, though, I'm going to copy this code. I'm going to go over and create a new notebook and say new Python notebook. Here it is. Call it API training. And I'm going to paste that Luminoso from Luminoso, get the Luminoso client. And the next thing, I'm going to go back over to my slides. I'm going to go find that code for the project URL I want to use, and then I'm going to print out all of those values. You could write your own parser. I'm going to put the project URL in there. I usually do these in separate functions here. In general, I'm going to use a different one here because I don't know what that one is. The one we're going to use today is the vitamin gummies project. That's the one we were looking at before we went and got that token. Going to go back a little bit here, and the URL it doesn't have API, it has app. So that's the user interface, projects. This number is your workspace ID, and we could talk about this. Every user can be in multiple workspaces, and every user typically has their own specific workspace. So in general, this is the workspace this project is saved under, and this is the project ID. Typically, you only need project ID, but in this case, when I split apart the URL, it's nice to just go get the one here and paste it into my project URL. This one can have highlights. The way this works, it can have highlights. It starts from the beginning and counts slashes instead of getting something from the end. I set the project URL value, and I'm going to split it up. And at this point, I can go and see what is the API URL. And there it is, API. So I went and got all of this and created the API URL. You do this because sometimes if you have an on-site version, we have a lot of customers with on-site versions, it might have a different name here, your company name.luminoso.com. If you're in Europe, it's EU-Daylight. If you're in Australia, it's AU-Daylight. If you're in Japan, it's JP-Daylight, I'm pretty sure. So we have a lot of different hosts that you can use. So you need that URL right there. We've got the workspace ID, the project ID. So you have all those values saved now just using that simple split URL function. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is, again, the standard client connection does look like this, where I give it a project ID, I give it the URL, I connect, and then once I've connected with that base URL, I create a new client, and I say client for path projects project ID. So this is the next step in this piece of code. Remember, I haven't done anything yet, so let's go get both of those pieces of code. So I'm going to client connect using that root URL, and then I have a client project and a client root. So there it is, and I can print out what this is. Oh, it's going to print out the v5 URL, and this is API URL. Let's run that, and it comes back and it says, remember, we connected up to our project ID. We created a client for path from the root URL, client to client project, projects, project ID. Now that'll be the root for this guy. So any calls we make to here, if we give it a path, will start at project/project ID. And we say get. The get on a project ID returns the information about that project ID in JSON. What's the workspace? What time was it created? Who created it? That's me. Any description that was given? How many documents are in it? This vitamin project has 6,797 documents. What language it's in? Last time the metadata was updated. The build info. So if there was a build that kicked off, there will be a build info here. You can't go and get concepts if the build hasn't been completed. We can talk about that probably in another session. What the science version was, when the build started, when it's done. Sentiment is a separate build. We have that here where, we didn't skip sentiment. The start time of the sentiment, the end time, these are all epoch time. They're integers since Unix 1972, something like that. And whether it was successful or not, and whether the core build, remember there are different builds, the core build versus the sentiment build. And then you've got this last successful, the project name, the project ID, and the permissions that you have on that. So that's how you get information about a project. And we've already got our API going here. So if you want to connect with an environment variable token, this might be how you do it. The code here is if there is a token in the OS environment, let's go and get it, and then we're going to pass the token on here. So we just have a couple different ways to connect. I'm just showing you how, depending on your environment, you might be running on some kind of back-end system, and you're not going to have somebody go and say lumi-save token. You just want to go get an environment variable and pass it in. We do that a lot too. If you're using another language, when you pass that token in, you put it on the header, and the header looks like this. It's the authorization header, and the value is token, space, and that value of that Lumi token. And so if you're using JavaScript or Java, you're going to be setting that header like that. I'm just going to do a quick couple of things and get a couple of documents, maybe get a couple of concepts, and then we're done, and you know how to use the API, and we'll start digging in on other sessions from there. So the idea of a document is that it has basically three values: the text, the title, and the metadata. The text is what we use to process. The title is just for displaying in the user interface. We don't do any analysis on this. And then the metadata. Metadata values can have strings, numbers, dates, scores, and this is what they would look like. Each metadata field has a type. It has the name of the metadata field and the value for this specific document. Same thing with number. It has a name, it has a value, and a date, and a score. So those are our different types of metadata. So let's just jump right in. This section shows, we're going to look at this documents endpoint. So if I'm going to get some documents out of this, I'm going to say client, and we're going to say client project.get. The root of the URL, in this case, we are already there. Projects, project ID, docs, limit how many you want, and the offset. So I could call this in a batch system if I have a lot of documents. You don't want to say, download me 2 million documents right now. You have to do it in batches. That's an HTTP issue. That's not a Luminoso issue. It's common web service practice. So let's just go and get a document out of this thing. Client underscore, let's say docs, equals client underscore project dot get. Remember, this one is at /project/project ID already. So if I say /docs, which was outlined in that documentation here, if I go to get documents, remember it's projects, project ID, docs, and there's lots of different things that we can use, filters and concept selectors and limits and offsets and things like that. And we'll talk about those in another session. But if I just want to get some docs, and I'm going to limit it, limit equals 1. I'm just going to get one document here, and then I'm going to print that out. So this goes and gets the document. So the result of this call is a JSON object, and it's a dictionary. The result is a list. It's a list of documents. It only has one document in it. The document has the text that was originally given. It came half empty. The title, it was 3 stars. Here's all the metadata. These are the metadata fields that are in this project. It has things like the date of it, the rating. They give it a score of 3. This was a 150 count bottle of vitamins. The type of vitamins is a 1-a-day women's. There's lots of videos on this specific project, I'm pretty sure. And I've added some other fields here. We can talk about how those get added. We have some other scripts that can add sentiment filters to these projects as well. We have plenty of sentiment, but I added some other things as well. The actual terms on this document. So the term is come, half, empty. So remember, it is a stop word. So that didn't show up as a term, but it does show up of where these other terms exist. Fragments are the non-collocation version, if any of these are collocations. Every document and every concept has a vector. That's how we understand the relationships between all of the concepts. And this wasn't done with search, so there's no match score. The document has a UID. And there's another field in here I want to get. There's one more. So this is kind of, it has a lot of information in this vector, but mostly it's just the data that we put into it. There's another piece of information. If I look at getting documents, there is a flag here called include sentiment on concepts. This one's fairly new. It's very interesting. And I'll say docs equals client underscore project dot get docs sentiment. And I'm going to say I want to get it with /docs and limit equals 1 and include sentiment on concepts equals true. And then I'm going to print out these docs. So this is going to have a little bit of more information. Now, when I see these terms, this term of come is negative, and confidence is 99. This term of half is negative of 99, and this term of empty is negative of 99% confidence. So that's a way to get confidence. You can do that on every document once the confidence builds, and we can build really interesting things with that. That's one of the ways that I built out this other metadata field on there. We can talk about that as well. I'll do one last thing on concepts. If I want to get some concepts on this, I can just say concepts equals client project dot get, and I'm just going to say /concepts, and I'm going to say limit, I think I can say limit 110. Oops, client project, I got to type that right. It says that I need, there's no limit on this, so I'll just take that off and see what happens. I think that the limit would go into what we call the concept selector. Oh, I didn't print it out. There's the concepts. These are the top concepts within this project. Again, vitamins is the top concept. Its relevance is how I would sort them when it comes back. It has the texts and the terms, and the next one is gummies. The term is gummy, and the vector for that, the relevance, the next is taste. So we have the top concepts in this project. So that's the way we get set up and how to use the API. The next step probably is to start talking about filters. I can get all the top concepts for the filter of Women's One A Day, or all the filters for the concepts of reviews of the 1 and 5, or 1 and 2, or 4 and 5. I want to know what the top concepts are around the worst of the reviews and the best of the reviews. So I can start getting that information out using filters. And the other way is with concept selectors, which are interesting. And I can say, hey, return me the top concepts, which is the default. And then I can do this based on a concept list. Remember, in Daylight UI and with the API, you can create concept lists. Say, I want to watch the packaging and the transportation and the cost and the taste and the flavor. I want to watch all those concepts. I put them in a shared concept list, and I can pass that here to get the concepts around just those terms. I can specify a concept that I want information on. I can get all the related concepts to something. Say vitamins. What are all the related concepts to that? You see that if I have excellent here and I look at all the related concepts, it's good, great, perfect. And so I can get that through the API using related concepts. Suggested concepts, these are our concept clusters, and sentiment suggested, unique to filter, and driver suggested. All of these have, we could talk for a whole session on each of those, and we probably will. But that is the API training for now of how to get set up and how to actually look at, get some quick information out of the API around documents and concepts. I really appreciate your time and thank you for listening.